What began as an ordinary church service unfolded into a moment no one saw coming, one that would soon dominate conversations far beyond the sanctuary walls. At first glance, it seemed harmless, a short sermon clip uploaded online, no different from countless others shared every day. But within minutes, a few carefully chosen words ignited a storm. During a routine message to his congregation, Bishop Wooden, a figure widely regarded for his influence and credibility in church circles, shifted the atmosphere of the room. Everything felt familiar until he referenced the Women Evolve conference. His delivery was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably confident. Then came the remark that changed everything. He labeled the conference a heathen gathering. In that instant, what was meant for a local audience became a global conversation. The sermon didn't stay confined to the church. It spread rapidly, recorded, clipped, reposted, and debated across social platforms. Viewers replayed the moment repeatedly, dissecting his words, searching for clarity, intent, and implication. A private teaching had transformed into a public controversy almost overnight. The shock was understandable. Women Evolve had earned a reputation as a powerful space for women seeking spiritual growth, encouragement, and a deeper connection to their faith. For many, it symbolized empowerment rooted in belief. That contrast, between the conference's positive image and Bishop Wooden's stern assessment, only intensified the reaction. What truly fueled the fire, however, was the certainty with which he spoke. This wasn't framed as a passing thought or personal preference. He issued a warning, urging his listeners to guard what they absorb spiritually and reminding them that not everything labeled faith-based aligns with Scripture. His message carried weight and consequences. Supporters applauded his stance, calling it courageous and uncompromising leadership. Critics saw something else entirely, an unnecessary rebuke aimed at women earnestly pursuing their spiritual journey. The lines were drawn quickly, and the internet became the arena where opinions clashed. One question echoed louder than the rest: why now? Women Evolve wasn't a fringe gathering. It had grown into a major movement, drawing thousands, featuring prominent voices, and commanding significant online influence. This wasn't a dispute between minor figures, it was a collision of power, visibility, and belief. Authority met popularity. Tradition confronted evolution. And the impact was impossible to overlook. As the conversation escalated, Bishop Wooden added another layer of concern. He cautioned that certain teachings, if left unquestioned, could quietly steer believers off course. Though he offered no specifics, the warning alone was enough to spark unease. Some began revisiting past conference footage, searching for subtle errors or troubling undertones. Others pushed back just as strongly, sharing testimonies of answered prayers, healing, and genuine spiritual transformation. What started as a single sermon moment had become something far larger, a debate about faith, discernment, influence, and who gets to define spiritual truth in a rapidly changing world. What made the situation even more tangled was that both sides were pointing to the same moments and clips to defend their arguments. Instead of bringing clarity, that overlap only deepened the confusion. Reactions online intensified by the hour. Supporters applauded the bishop's stance, praising him as fearless and transparent. Critics pushed back just as hard, accusing him of being dismissive and unjust. Those watching from the middle tried to weigh both perspectives, but the sheer volume of opinions made it difficult to see clearly. What truly surprised many was how quickly the discussion expanded beyond a single remark. Almost overnight, it evolved into a broader debate about women's influence, authority, and leadership within the church. As time passed, quiet voices from inside church circles suggested this tension hadn't come out of nowhere. Some believed this moment had been building for years, while others felt it could have been prevented if handled differently. By then, the narrative had already shifted. Headlines emphasized conflict rather than nuance, and people with no personal connection to either Women Evolve or Bishop Wooden were suddenly forming strong, unwavering opinions. The story felt incomplete, as though something larger was waiting beneath the surface. And just when it seemed the controversy had peaked, subtle rumors began circulating, whispers of private discussions and behind-the-scenes disagreements. Nothing was officially confirmed, but even the possibility added fuel to the fire. People leaned in, watching closely, sensing that this clash was far from over and that the reality might be far more layered than it first appeared. Instead of fading, the conversation grew heavier with each passing day. People began digging deeper, examining both sides with intensity. What once sounded like a single controversial statement now felt like a warning echoing across the church world. Bishop Wooden's words were replayed again and again as listeners searched for his true intent. Many came to a sobering realization: this wasn't only about one conference. It was about power, influence, fear, and control. Pressure soon fell on Women Evolve's leadership. Their names trended online, and their silence sparked speculation. Eventually, responses emerged, measured and calm. They reaffirmed that the conference had always centered on faith, prayer, and personal transformation. They spoke of women coming to heal, to learn, and to reconnect spiritually. But instead of easing the tension, these explanations seemed to deepen it. The audience grew more divided, not less. And here's the unexpected part: some longtime church members admitted feeling conflicted. They respected Bishop Wooden and trusted his leadership, yet they had personally experienced growth and renewal through Women Evolve. These voices weren't loud, but they carried weight. They shared stories of restored confidence, renewed faith, and meaningful change. Their uncertainty reflected what many others felt but hesitated to express. Meanwhile, supporters of the bishop became even more vocal, insisting that spiritual leaders have a responsibility to warn their communities. Popularity, they argued, does not equal truth. For them, this was about safeguarding faith itself. What made the situation so complex was that both sides felt justified, and both felt misrepresented. There was no obvious villain, only deeply rooted convictions colliding. Then came another shift. Old sermons and interviews of Bishop Wooden resurfaced, revealing a consistent pattern. In the past, he had openly challenged movements he believed were drifting too far from Scripture. That discovery changed how many people interpreted the controversy. It no longer felt sudden or impulsive. Instead, it seemed rooted in long-held beliefs rather than poor timing. Younger audiences, however, reacted swiftly. Many felt alienated by what they perceived as condemnation. They questioned whether the church was offering guidance or building barriers, and some openly said such moments drive people away instead of drawing them closer. This sparked an entirely new debate, not just about Women Evolve, but about where the church itself is headed. Behind closed doors, reports of concern surfaced. Some leaders feared the public divide would cause lasting harm, while others believed confrontation was unavoidable. What began as a warning had now grown into a threat to unity, shifting the focus from truth alone to the consequences of how that truth is delivered. As emotions continued to rise, many sensed that something bigger was coming. This didn't feel like an ending, it felt like a pause before another wave. Questions remained unanswered, and the silence between statements felt heavier than any response. Everyone waited, aware that the next development could reshape the story yet again. Meanwhile, social media overflowed with videos, commentary, and debate. People from around the world weighed in, some shocked, some confused, others outraged. Many struggled to understand how a single sermon could spark such widespread turmoil. And yet, it had. One thing was undeniable: Bishop Wooden's words had opened a door that could not be closed. This was the moment the narrative crossed a line, from a single controversial remark into a sweeping conversation about belief, leadership, and who holds authority within sacred spaces. People began pulling threads from the past, comparing older conferences, archived sermons, and long-forgotten interviews. Some pointed to recurring themes in the bishop's previous critiques, while others highlighted the tangible outcomes and testimonies tied to Women Evolve. Each side came armed with compelling evidence, and instead of simplifying the issue, it made everything more layered. Here's what stunned many observers. Footage from Women Evolve events showed women praying, studying scripture, and openly sharing testimonies that appeared deeply rooted in biblical teaching. Yet despite this, the label of heathen continued to circulate, spreading rapidly and stubbornly. At that point, theologians, church insiders, and faith commentators began to step in, offering a broader explanation. They suggested the controversy was less about one event and more about a long-standing struggle between tradition and change within the church. That's what truly set the situation apart. It wasn't a clean divide between truth and error, it was a collision of generations, interpretations, and lived experiences. Younger believers felt energized and affirmed by evolving approaches to faith, while older leaders feared the erosion of principles they had guarded for decades. What started as Bishop Wooden versus Women Evolve now felt symbolic of something much larger. The conflict began to resemble a snapshot of a church in transition. And then things grew even more complicated. Subtle leaks and whispered accounts hinted at friction behind closed doors. Reports suggested church leaders were divided on how to respond, aware that any public statement could either soothe tensions or push them further out of control. Those quiet hints revealed that far more was at stake than anyone initially realized. Every reaction was now under a microscope. Even small comments carried the power to ignite fresh waves of debate. What surprised many most was how deeply personal the issue became. Church members began sharing their internal conflicts online, confessions of loyalty to Bishop Wooden alongside gratitude for the transformation they had experienced through Women Evolve. For these individuals, the debate wasn't theoretical. It forced them to wrestle with their own faith, asking difficult questions about where spiritual guidance ends and where control might begin. What unfolded publicly began to quietly reshape private belief journeys, stirring uncertainty in places that once felt stable. Faith leaders warned that if such tensions continued unresolved, they could leave lasting marks, especially on how women's ministries are viewed and how leadership roles are defined within the church. Slowly, people began wondering if this was the start of a new era, one marked by constant friction between long-standing traditions and modern expressions of faith. The story had clearly grown beyond any single figure or movement. It now reflected a shifting spiritual landscape, and all eyes were fixed on what might come next. As whispers of an official response circulated, the tension peaked. Even the most reserved voices within church circles began to gain attention. Rumors suggested that influential leaders were preparing statements that might openly challenge the bishop's stance. At that point, it was clear this was no ordinary disagreement. It felt like a defining moment that could reshape perceptions of women's ministries for years to come. What had once been quiet unease, shared only in private prayers and hushed conversations, was now unfolding in full view. The atmosphere felt charged, heavy with the sense that something irreversible was already in motion. Even those previously uninterested in church politics found themselves drawn in, trying to grasp what this moment meant, not just for one group, but for the future of faith communities altogether. At first, many hoped it would fade away, just another disagreement destined to cool with time. After all, the church had survived countless debates over doctrine and leadership before. But this felt different. The tone had shifted. This was no longer about clearing up a misunderstanding, it was about visibility, power, and the fundamental question of whose voices are allowed to shape spiritual spaces. The emotional weight behind every response made one thing clear: something deeper was being exposed. Some insiders spoke quietly of reconciliation efforts, private meetings filled with prayer, reflection, and a shared desire to protect unity. They described moments of hesitation, long silences, and cautious hope that common ground might still be found. According to them, healing felt fragile, but possible. Others weren't so sure. They warned that once conflict becomes public, it rarely stays contained. Narratives harden, sides solidify, and emotion begins to overpower reason. Each new statement risked escalating the situation further. Pride, fear, and public pressure, they cautioned, could make compromise feel like weakness rather than wisdom. Nothing felt insignificant anymore. A single sentence could trigger hours of debate, while silence itself was analyzed and interpreted. People dissected tone, posture, and timing, replaying clips repeatedly in search of hidden meaning. Even outsiders felt compelled to comment, sensing this conflict mirrored wider conversations about gender, authority, and tradition. Social media transformed into both a courtroom and a battlefield. Supporters gathered proof, resurfaced old material, and connected dots that had long remained unspoken. Comment sections overflowed with impassioned arguments, heartfelt testimonies, and painful admissions from women who felt overlooked for years. Others defended tradition with equal conviction, insisting that change must move carefully and remain anchored in established teaching. The sheer intensity of engagement made one thing undeniable: this issue had struck a nerve far deeper than anyone expected. Many began to wonder whether reconciliation was still within reach or if the situation was slowly hardening into a permanent fracture. Some held on to hope, believing that once the initial shock faded, space would open for calmer, more thoughtful conversations. They trusted that faith communities, at their best, are capable of reflection, humility, and change. Others were far more skeptical. In their view, the conflict had already crossed a point of no return. Once positions were taken so publicly, stepping back would feel less like wisdom and more like defeat, making unity harder to reclaim. What intensified everything was the emotional weight carried by those closest to the issue. Women who had poured years into ministry suddenly found themselves questioning their value and place. Anger surfaced for some, grief for others, and for many, a deep weariness set in, the kind that comes from repeatedly having to defend one's calling. This wasn't a theoretical argument for them. It reached into their faith, identity, and sense of purpose. Each new update reopened wounds they had quietly endured in the name of peace. Church leaders felt the strain as well. They stood under pressure from every direction, trying to navigate responsibility, tradition, and compassion all at once. Some felt trapped between personal conviction and congregational expectation. Others worried that any response, or lack of one, would be twisted or weaponized. Leadership in moments like this felt heavy, and not everyone bore it with certainty. For some, silence became protection; for others, it revealed hesitation and fear. Here's what few expected. Even those closest to Women Evolve admitted that the bishop's words forced difficult reflection. Conversations long avoided suddenly surfaced. People who assumed they had clarity realized how little they had truly listened. That single statement cracked open a wall that had stood unquestioned for generations. And once the crack appeared, hard questions rushed in, demanding honesty rather than comfort. The discussion spilled into everyday life. Families talked it through at dinner tables. Friends debated late into the night. Prayer groups found themselves wrestling with discomfort instead of seeking easy answers. For many, it triggered deep self-examination. They questioned whether their beliefs were grounded in faith or shaped by fear, whether tradition had become a shield against necessary change. These realizations weren't easy, but they were powerful. One moment had disrupted complacency on a scale few could have imagined. The situation revealed something profound about the weight of words spoken from positions of authority. What may have been intended as clarity or conviction instead became a catalyst for widespread introspection. It exposed how fragile unity can be when long-silenced issues are finally voiced. It also showed that silence can no longer protect systems built on unspoken agreements. As days turned into weeks, anticipation lingered. People waited for the next response, the next clarification, the next sign of direction. Some hoped for an apology or a softened tone. Others expected a doubling down, a firmer stance. Each possible outcome carried consequences, and everyone sensed that the next move could define legacies. Away from screens and public arguments, many turned inward. They prayed for wisdom, healing, and courage, the courage to face truths they once avoided. A quiet realization settled in: no matter how this resolved, things would not return to how they were. Awareness had shifted. Voices had been amplified. The collective consciousness of the church had changed. Whether temporary or lasting, the divide reshaped conversations. Women felt empowered to speak where they once remained silent. Supporters felt challenged to listen rather than dismiss. Even critics were pushed to articulate their views more clearly instead of leaning on assumptions. In that sense, painful as it was, the moment became a reckoning. No one knew how it would end. Reconciliation remained possible, but so did separation. What was undeniable was what had been revealed: the tension between tradition and transformation, authority and empathy, fear and hope. It became a reminder that history often shifts not through dramatic events, but through a single moment when silence breaks and people are forced to respond. And this is where it deepens. What began as one statement quickly unraveled into something far larger than anyone anticipated. Social media didn't merely react, it became a stage where beliefs were performed, examined, praised, and condemned in real time. Platforms once filled with sermon clips and inspiration transformed into battlegrounds of conviction. Younger believers, many already wrestling quietly with questions of inclusion, progress, and representation, finally spoke openly. Their words carried exhaustion, urgency, and emotion. They talked about feeling overlooked, about longing for a church that reflected their lived realities and their understanding of justice. Across from them stood traditionalists who viewed the bishop's words not as harm, but as courage. To them, plain speech signaled strong leadership. They defended his responsibility to speak without bending to public pressure. For them, faith was not meant to shift with culture, and compromise felt dangerously close to surrender. Their responses were firm, deeply rooted in the fear that the foundation of the church itself was being eroded. Between these voices stood a growing realization: this was no longer just a disagreement. It was a defining moment.